So maybe we'll get started.
Sure.
For those of you that sort of joined in as it got to be 8 o'clock, we were having kind of an interesting, Mark and Bill Drays were having kind of an interesting discussion about hiring and labor and that sort of thing in the railroad industry. Maybe I'll just add to that too from a couple things that I'm aware of. One is that this seems to be an issue with every industry, not just transportation. And I did see one of the things that's ended up hurting the railroads and Amtrak and others is that during the pandemic, they furloughed people and they haven't been able to get them back. The railroads have a history of when they have a downturn in business, they furlough their employees and then expect them to come back when business comes up. I know there was a recent story about Norfolk Southern, their CEO saying next time they have a downturn in business, they're not going to furlough employees. They're going to keep them on because they did some analysis that it was cheaper to keep employees on who weren't as productive than it was to have to hire new employees and train them and all that sort of thing. So it's interesting how some of these things are coming out. The labor shortage with Amtrak has certainly exacerbated their equipment shortages and their ability to run trains, and Rail Passenger Association, which Mark is a counselor on, has been very critical of that. So unfortunately, they are where they are now and trying to come back. So that might be a topic we can discuss as we get into things today. But thanks everybody for joining us this morning. This is a meeting of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition, and we appreciate your joining us today. I need to share my screen, don't I? I can't just talk about what's going to be on my screen without sharing it. And hang on a second. I'm working with multiple screens, so all right, you should be seeing a map of West Central Wisconsin with some of the contact information for the Rail Coalition. So if you're not seeing that, let me know. One of the challenges, if any of you run a PowerPoint on Zoom, is that I don't see what you see. So I also won't see, once I share a screen, I don't necessarily see if anybody raises their hand or anything. So I am going to invite you as we go along. We'll definitely can have some discussion, but just go ahead and speak up if you have a question as we go. Essentially what we're going to do today is give you an update on where things are with trying to establish passenger rail service to West Central Wisconsin. And we've had a lot of positive activity and developments over the last year in that regard. So a lot of this is going to be giving a little bit of background and an update. I'm currently serving as chair of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. We also have a board of directors. We ourselves have been coming out of COVID, and we did have an in-person annual meeting in January, and our board will be looking at things as we get into the summer as to how we want to continue our activities, get committees going again, and work on building support for passenger rail service over the next couple of years in our region. So I'll get started and give you as much of an update as I know about, and feel free to ask questions or jump in or add information as we go along as well. So I'll just introduce myself real quickly. I do wear a few different hats. Where I'm sitting right now is my office at the Eau Claire Area Chamber of Commerce, where I am Vice President, Governmental Affairs. The Chamber has been involved since the beginning of efforts with the Rail Coalition to establish passenger rail service to our region. In fact, my first exposure to that was when I joined the Chamber, when I moved to town 21 years ago as a business person. And Jackie Pavelski was in this role here, now retired. And she told me about this effort, and I got involved in it. We've already talked about that I'm chair of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. And then we have a couple other things that I'm involved in that are closely related. One is the Chippewa St. Croix Rail Commission, which I'll talk about in a few moments. And then I am also one of Wisconsin's 4 representatives on the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, which is an 8-state body formed by compact between those states. And I'm the designated private sector representative there. And they coordinate efforts among the states for passenger rail operations and expansion. So going back a little bit to where the Rail Coalition is coming from and how we were established. As I understand it, the impetus really came in the late 90s when this map was out. And I don't know how well you can read it on your screen, but this is the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative, which under Governor Thompson in Wisconsin, our state was one of the leaders working with a potential system that might look like this for expansions of passenger rail service in our region. And when our leaders from our area saw that the only service to our West Central region was a bus connection from Eau Claire to Toma, they had some concerns and started working on what can we do. And so they created what is now the Rail Coalition as a committee of Momentum West, which is our regional economic development organization. And some of the early leaders were have indeed passed along, like Owen Ayers, the founder of Ayers Associates, Bill Leinenkugel, president of Leinenkugel Brewing Company, Ray Willoughby from Alliance Bank, and other leaders in our community. And the mission of the Rail Coalition is to develop passenger rail service through our area as part of a regional strategy for a balanced transportation system. It was business and community and educational leaders that really got the ball rolling. And so the economic side of that has been an emphasis as well. Reasons that we, as a coalition, thought it was justifiable to look at passenger rail service for our region. We have some of the fastest growing counties and cities in Wisconsin. We have several state universities and technical colleges, and we have significant commerce between here and the Twin Cities in particular that we can have connections when we get there, and it is a highly traveled corridor. And when we got into our FRA application, we'll talk to you in a few minutes about, we found that traffic is increasing again and is up to 32% in some areas of truck traffic that affects our mobility. So the initial efforts of the Rail Coalition were to literally get on the map. And WSDOT came out with this report in 2004 that showed that service to the Eau Claire region and West Central Wisconsin was feasible economically for the overall system. And they found that both a through route where some trains would go through the current route in La Crosse and some through Eau Claire and Menominee was feasible, as well as strictly Eau Claire to the Twin Cities corridor. Subsequently, the Minnesota Rail Plan included Eau Claire to the Twin Cities, and the Wisconsin State Rail Plan that was developed in the early 2000s or early 2010s also said that it envisioned future service to this area. But one of the things the Rail Coalition recognized is just getting on the map itself is important. You have to be there, but you need to do more to get passenger rail service. And so the leaders of the Rail Coalition and volunteers started looking around at what are some of the things we can learn about where there have been successful passenger rail developments around the country. We looked at things like Brightline going on in Florida, where the development of real estate around a frequent passenger rail service has been fueling that effort. We looked at Normal, Illinois, where it's a mid-sized Midwest city with a state university. They've had significant economic development. And we looked at the fact that in a lot of regions where there is a local commission or authority, either to manage the service or to do what we've been doing and to advocate for it, has added to the credibility and the success. And so we started looking at that. We also looked at our line and know that on the other end of our state, the Hiawatha service has been one of the most successful in the country. If you're not familiar with it, that's the 7 trains a day that Wisconsin and Illinois work with Amtrak to provide, and is coming back now in terms of ridership post-COVID, but very successful and continue to grow ridership. And Wisconsin DOT and Illinois are continuing to see how they can improve and expand that service, and they have a goal of getting it up to 10 round trips per day. So as we did that, here's a map of our corridor, and we started focusing on what can we do to get a service like that started here as the first step to having passenger rail service to our region, with a longer term vision of being through service east and west. And one of the things we did in 2021, because of the interest of local government jurisdictions, the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission was formed. And among those invited to do so, who ultimately passed resolutions to say we're going to start this commission under a state statute that allows a coordination of transportation projects among local government entities. So the St. Croix, Dunn, and Eau Claire counties, as well as the municipalities of Altoona, Eau Claire, Menominee, Baldwin, New Richmond, and Hudson, all passed resolutions to establish the commission. Subsequently, the commission itself invited the Rail Coalition to be a full voting member, and then also invited several key stakeholders to be ex officio members, and that includes the Union Pacific Railroad, over whose tracks service would run, DOTs in Wisconsin and Minnesota, the two counties in Minnesota, the Regional Planning Commission here in West Central Wisconsin, and then the institutions of higher learning, UW's Eau Claire, Stout, and River Falls, as well as CVTC and Northwood Technical College. And they have been participating in the meetings and been part of some of the planning that's been going on. And the commission has become very active this year because of the next thing I'm going to talk about. And that is the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in late 2021. It charged the Federal Railroad Administration with developing a program to take some substantial advance appropriations and develop passenger rail service in our country. There's a lot of numbers on this screen, but the big ones to pay attention to are the fact that it has $66 billion in total funding over the course of its 5-year life. And the perspective on that is this is a chart that FRA has that shows the previous 10 years of how much federal support went into passenger rail service and how much is available for the next 5 years. And what you can see is actually each year of these 5 years is more authorized funding than Congress and the federal government provided over the entire previous 10 years. And what's also significant about this, and this chart may be a little bit hard to read, but the programs where you look at the very bottom line here. So this is sort of going from left to right, the process of getting passenger rail service established on various corridors and how FRA is rolling out this new program they created. So something they did last year was they asked for expressions of interest of corridors. And then they started asking for corridors to be submitted to FRA to be designated for eligibility for funding. The next step then, recognizing that because of the lack of funding in the past, local entities and states have not really been ready with projects, and they want to get a project pipeline going. So they have created this initial scoping and program initiation funding, where if a corridor is accepted by FRA, they provide $500,000 in seed money without a requirement of a local match. So that really jumpstarts the planning process, starts corridors getting ready for doing the next steps of development if they're a new corridor. Existing corridors can also be part of this so that they can undertake planning and get ready to do more. And then once a corridor is accepted and they get the planning done, moving forward, if they develop something called a service development plan, that requires a 10% local state match, and then actually doing the project, which would include the environmental clearances, equipment, capital, that sort of thing, it's a 20% match. Those matches themselves are much more attractive on a federal funding basis than previously with states. So before this, some of the programs you may know that Wisconsin has been successful in getting, at best, they were a 50% federal match and a 50 or more percent state or local match. So these are much more attractive. There is also a program that I don't have listed here called Restoration and Enhancement Grants, and they provide for a declining federal operating support when a new service is started or new frequencies. And it starts at 90% and then declines over 6 years to give a state or a locality the opportunity to really get ridership built. So this is a table that FRA came out with last year. And then in December, they issued a Federal Register notice saying, okay, we're ready. Here's the details as to how do you submit a corridor. And ultimately, the deadline for submitting those corridors was March 27th. And so the Chippewa St. Croix Rail Commission was very aware of this, and because of the way it was formed, is an eligible entity under the Federal Register notices. And so during the last few months, starting late last fall, in anticipation of this notice and ending in March, the commission worked with the Association of Innovative Passenger Rail Operators, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, RBC Associates, which is a consulting firm in Washington, to undertake a series of market sounding activities and to work with us to put an application together for FRA. And we had a subcommittee of the commission, which included Chairman Jim Dunning, who is also on our board. I know Jim is on the call today. Also Jeremy Gregert from the Eau Claire City Council, and Shell from the West Central, retired from West Central Regional Planning Commission, and also Jeff Abbott, a retired Wisconsin DOT official who's been working with us over the years. And all of us spent some time going through this application, put together an application, which many of you have seen, and got it submitted to the FRA a few days in advance of the deadline. And in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about just what's in that application and why we think it's unique. So as this process rolled out, a lot of organizations talked about what kind of vision they might have. And even before the process started, Amtrak had released an expansion map that said, if we had funding available, here are some places we would expand our services. And zooming in on that, if you remember back to an early slide I showed, which was the Wisconsin State Rail Plan, Amtrak really took what Wisconsin had envisioned for future services, and they made that their map for this part of the Midwest and said, these are services we think would make sense, which includes expansions to Green Bay, and then on the Milwaukee to Twin Cities corridor, possibilities of some services operating via Madison and some of them operating via Eau Claire. So we're very positive to see that also coming from Amtrak. So over that process, we were in close consultation with Wisconsin DOT, Ramsey County in particular, as well as Minnesota DOT, as we developed our application. And then at the same time, Wisconsin DOT put in 4 applications by the deadline. So I'll give you a quick summary of what they put in. I think I mentioned earlier that existing corridors were eligible for designation for continued work and expansion. So Wisconsin DOT did put in the Milwaukee to Chicago Hiawatha service expansion. So as they continue to work on capital improvements, so they can expand and equipment, so they expand the number of trains each way, they have submitted that route. They also submitted service extension of the Hiawatha to Green Bay through Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, the Fox Cities, and Green Bay. Further continued work on the TCMC, which is the shorthand for Twin Cities, Milwaukee to Chicago project. That's a project that we expect to see a train operating as the second train between the Twin Cities and Chicago, hopefully later this year sometime, over the current route through La Crosse. And we'll touch base on that again in a few minutes. But they looked at designating that corridor. And then they also created a corridor for further study, which is the Milwaukee, Madison, Eau Claire, and Twin Cities, where the vision is taking the state rail plan and looking at how can some of the further Chicago to Twin Cities services be expanded and consider some going through Madison and or Eau Claire as those move forward. So here's just a little bit more of a close-up showing, you can see it's kind of the reddish pink line on this map that WSDOT expects to continue development on and has submitted that corridor to FRA. So they submitted 4 corridors. Also, Minnesota has submitted the Northern Lights Express, which is the Minneapolis to Duluth Superior, which does touch Wisconsin because it goes through Douglas County and would have a stop in Superior. So the main thing I want to talk about, though, is, of course, the Commission did submit a corridor to FRA independently of the WSDOT submissions, but with the support of Minnesota DOT and Wisconsin DOT, and an acknowledgement that those are complementary to each other and could both go forward and both operate together and be a plus for transportation in our regions. So what you're looking at here is the cover of the application that was submitted, a map that was created by West Central Regional Planning that shows the potential stops along the line. I think the Eau Claire, Altoona area would be the origination point. Stops in Menominee and Hudson, serving that area, as well as River Falls, are almost for sure stops. And then also considering the possibility that Baldwin, Stillwater, and or Lake Elmo in Minnesota might be potential stops, and that would be part of studying the route. So there's really 5 aspects of our application that we emphasized at its very beginning, and 4 of them are unique. The first, of course, is that the whole reason you do this is to meet important transportation needs for your communities. And so there's discussion in the report as to the need for this and how it will benefit mobility and the economy of our region. There's also several things that are unique about this application and makes us somewhat optimistic. So this is the region once again, somewhat optimistic that FRA may look on this and say, we want to go forward with this application because it allows us to look at a few different concepts. One is competitive operator selection. For the most part, Amtrak is the semi-private, semi-public national passenger train operator. They operate most of the state-supported services around the country, but there are potential other alternatives. And if you've been following our meetings, we were approached by the Association of Innovative Passenger Rail Operations some time ago to talk about their interest in being operators of passenger rail services on an intercity basis. All of these 4 organizations, and this slide also shows some of the other members of AI Pro, all operate passenger trains today. And in fact, every one of them, if you consider the international operations, a couple of them operate more trains and carry more passengers than Amtrak does. But you actually won't see their trade names on the side of any trains or streetcars because they operate on a contract basis. So for example, Herzog operates the CT Rail in Connecticut, the Rail Runner in New Mexico. I believe it's Transdev that operates the streetcar in Milwaukee on contract for the city of Milwaukee. And in fact, here's you can't read this, but just gives you an idea of the scope. Here's a list of the US operations that Herzog has, and then a more full list of what these 4 organizations do and some of the operations they have not only in the US, but internationally. And in fact, Keolis is a daughter company of the French National Railroad, so they have a lot of experience in a lot of things. One of the operations that Herzog has is called CT Rail. This is between New Haven, Hartford, and in Connecticut and Springfield, Massachusetts. Connecticut decided to expand service along this line. They considered how they might do it, and rather than simply hiring Amtrak to do it, they put it out for a competitive bid and ultimately decided to award the contract to Herzog. And what's interesting is that these coexist. So Amtrak has trains that run over these tracks, as does the CT rail with Herzog. And you can see even a picture here where they're side by side. They even have some joint ticketing, that sort of thing. So you could see a situation in our region too, where you might have through Amtrak service as well as a local operation. So the arguments of the AI Pro group is that they will be more transparent and be competitive in awarding and winning these contracts. They claim that they can provide superior service to Amtrak, and certainly Amtrak could bid on the service as well. But the idea is that when this service is implemented, you would make it competitive for being the operator. Another is a different model for accessing the railroad. Right now, Amtrak, because of its statutory authority, has a right to use railroad lines in the US, particularly those that joined Amtrak 52 years ago. And it's based on an avoidable cost formula. The railroads argue that that undercompensates them for use of their facilities. And then if they are going to entertain passenger rail service, they want to be made completely whole in terms of their current capacity. So that usually leads to substantial upfront capital to add sidings and do other things to not diminish the capacity the freight railroads have. Union Pacific is the operator of our line through here to St. Paul Union Depot. They have put substantial investments into this line, both in terms of track condition. They put in PTC, which is the signaling system needed for passenger rail service. And they have suggested that they would entertain a direct access model where instead of requiring a lot of upfront capital, they would negotiate the renting or sale or use of the capacity they currently have for a competitive market rate. And so that is something we are interested in pursuing and is part of our application to look at how that might play out. A couple other things. One is that we might consider using zero emission equipment on this line. Of course, there are many goals right now to get to no carbon and reduce carbon emissions. And certainly anytime you move somebody from an automobile or an airplane to a passenger train, even if it's diesel powered, you are gaining benefits and you're reducing carbon emissions because of the efficiency. But there's even an alternative to go to completely zero emission. We also had a presentation at one of the market sounding event we had at St. Paul Union Depot a few weeks ago, where Stadler, one of the manufacturers of equipment based in Switzerland with a plant in Utah, has a equipment called a FLIRT, F-L-I-R-T. That's an acronym, and I don't remember off the top of my head what it stands for, but it's set up to allow a different kinds of propulsion. It can be battery operated, it can be diesel, it can be overhead wire. And Stadler says they have developed and actually have a couple in use now, including one that's going into service in Southern California using hydrogen fuel cell technology. And they have suggested that because of the distance of this route and the expected frequency, that this kind of equipment might be a good pilot project for an intercity route in Wisconsin or in the U.S. That's another thing that is an aspect of this. And then finally, this can apply many places, but we are specifically calling out the idea that transportation-oriented development around stations and in our communities could be an important part of what we do moving forward, and one of the benefits of the service. And as we look at some other places, if you've been to Denver and seen what's happened around their Union Station, they built out an entire transit system over the last 20 years in Colorado. They've redeveloped the area around the station, and you've seen tremendous economic development happening there. Of course, Denver is a major city, as is Miami and Fort Lauderdale and Orlando, but we also see that tremendous economic development in the burgeoning inner city service between Fort Lauderdale and Miami that is in a few months going to be extended to Orlando Airport. But it's not only large cities. Normal, Illinois, which is a mid-sized city in Illinois, where Illinois State University is, certainly a similar community to Eau Claire and Altoona. They are on the Chicago to St. Louis corridor with 5 trains a day in each direction. And they have seen, they built a new station and they've seen tremendous development around that station, something on the order of 200 million plus in private development because of the location of the rail stop there. And we see that having access to transit has a lot of benefits. We know that many of the younger part of our population are interested in alternatives to driving and being able to use transit. And then as our aging baby boomer population gets older and may not always want or can drive, having housing and other things near transportation can be a real benefit. So that's one of the aspects of the service that we want to look hard at as well. Here's a list of the letters of support that we received for that application. So as I mentioned earlier, it includes the railroad, the 2 counties in Minnesota, DOTs of both Minnesota and Wisconsin, as well as other entities. So what's coming up next? The deadline was the end of March for these applications. FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, has said it will issue decisions about these in late summer, which we believe will be something like September. So that's when we'll know if we were awarded. One of the other benefits of this program, they have not released how many applications they received, but based on a lot of estimates of how many might be coming in and the amount of funding that FRA said they would have available for this program, it seems like a substantial number of the applications will be, if not all of them that are qualified, will have a substantially good chance of being awarded. So we're going to be cautiously optimistic, and we'll know in a few months whether we'll be awarded this and the commission can move forward. We had a meeting yesterday in Menominee that was also online, and we had an update for Wisconsin DOT, and we were able to have a discussion of things like if both applications are awarded, both the local commission one and the through corridor, WisDOT is committed to working with us on implementing those, doing whatever phases need to be possible, doing a lot of joint study of the next steps. And so I think it's fair to say we have a commitment from WisDOT, MnDOT, Ramsey County, Washington County to really see how this might work when that funding becomes available. So what I want to do as we close here is sort of give you a summary of what we see as then the ways that our communities would have access to passenger rail service going forward. But I've been talking a lot, so if anybody has any questions right now, I would be glad to answer them. And I can't necessarily see everybody the way I'm screen sharing, so just speak up if you have any questions.
Scott, I have a question.
Yeah, Bill.
On the map, it seemed like Madison was now a more integral part of the Amtrak train from Milwaukee through Eau Claire to the Twin Cities. Is that the case? And then a second question, Madison seemed to say they were going to give a train location area in April. Do you have any update on that?
No, and it reminds me of one thing I forgot to say, and so I'll answer your question because I had it written down here. Besides waiting for the decision, your Madison comment actually reminds me of that. We feel we need to be moving ahead and figuring out, being ready for things to go forward. And so the commission yesterday decided to create a committee to look at things like station site selection, transportation-oriented development, to be ready to do more when the funding comes through. And so Jim Dunning, our chair, will be appointing a committee of members of the commission who are then going to form a working group to start looking at things like what do you have to have physically for a passenger rail station? What do you need to look at in terms of local zoning? What are the opportunities for transportation-oriented development economically, and what kind of programs are available there? And Ray Chambers and Mason Baxter from RBC also, they worked for us on contract as we did the market soundings and got the application together. And they have agreed to continue working with us at no additional charge in the interim period until we know about the funding to kind of help facilitate that that effort as well. So I think what basically happened is, let's see if I can go back to, if you don't mind me doing this, I'm just going to go back to the map. That's going to take too long. I'm sorry. So I'm not going to do that. But you mentioned the map that WSDOT decided to do one application for the Chicago to Twin Cities corridor via both Madison and Eau Claire. We did have a discussion actually with Lisa Stern a little bit about that yesterday and how that might phase in. I think they just made the decision that they were already putting in 4 applications and that they could handle that whole question of what is your routing between Milwaukee and the Twin Cities under one really effort that they would coordinate with us. And so she said, once they get into that, that would determine where they go. So a conceivable phasing of that would be start the Eau Claire to Twin Cities service, extend some Hiawatha's to Madison, and then in the future, look at extensions west from Madison or east from Eau Claire. So it's kind of, I think, to really put all of those in the same bucket and see what will work the best. I didn't mention the FRA Midwest study, and I probably should have. It showed the Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Twin Cities is probably the highest potential corridor in the whole upper Midwest. And because Madison is specified on that corridor, it sort of makes sense to look at it all together as they go forward. I have not heard where Madison is on their study. What they did was they hired one of the consulting firms to come in and look at the various potential station sites in Madison, including East Metro or east of downtown, Monona Terrace, the Oscar Mayer location, because they have probably a less certainty as where the best station location will be. And I think they wanted to get ahead of the game as well. But I haven't heard the outcome of that or when that's expected. I don't know if anybody else is on that is more tuned into that. So does that answer your question, Bill?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Scott, this is Mark. One question I have, and with Lisa Stern having spoke with you just recently, have there been any updates or developments regarding shuttle connection plans with the potential startup service for the second daily train, in September, October, whenever that occurs?
I didn't ask her that yesterday. I have in the past, and I think the answer has been, if I can paraphrase it, is that they want to get all the pieces together for the train, and then they'll work on the shuttle. So it is in their plan, whether it'll be start from day one, but it does continue to be something they plan to work on.
Okay, and I'm assuming that they will be doing some kind of a marketing or promotional effort once those shuttle development plans are in place, I assume.
Yeah, actually, one of the answers too has been they really want to work with the localities on, where should they stop here? How should they get out to the community to create awareness? So that would be part of what they would do. They do some marketing already. Crystal DuPont, some of you might know, who works in the Milwaukee office, works with Amtrak on the Hiawatha marketing, and they've also done some marketing of the Green Bay connection. So it probably would be something similar to that.
Sure, thanks.
And that's actually what I'm going to talk about next. So maybe I'll get into that, and then if you have other questions. So just sort of a recap. And it's interesting because those of us that have been involved in this, we go back a few years, and it was like we were trying to create opportunities for passenger rail service under an environment that wasn't that friendly to it. And hopefully all of that work's coming to fruition now, because we're somewhat maybe more ready than other regions to go after it. But the main options we've been looking at are, of course, frequent regional Eau Claire to Twin Cities service. With a short corridor like this, we also don't think we can afford to start with maybe one train a day, given it's 90 to 100 miles, that would not be convenient enough to be successful. Through service, Chicago to Milwaukee to Twin Cities, that has actually become more possible, and we don't even know which one's going to be more feasible first, or maybe we get them both at the same time. And then the other one is the one Mark just asked about, that's the throughway shuttle connections to existing Amtrak stations, such as Menominee and Eau Claire to Toma. So Wisconsin and Minnesota are getting ready to launch the TCMC service from St. Paul to Chicago. They are still hoping to start it this year. There are some infrastructure improvements that are planned. They have an agreement with the railroad that they can actually start service before the infrastructure improvements are completed, but have to commit to making sure they do happen. And they're mostly in La Crosse and Winona areas. And this is a map from their information about it. And you can see that they are envisioning connections to Eau Claire, Rochester, and Madison as part of the implementation of that service. And those of you that look around the country know that, in particular, California has been extremely successful in having these offline connections feeding into its corridors. And so being able to buy a ticket from Eau Claire or Menominee to Milwaukee or Chicago and not having to drive to Toma certainly opens up more opportunities, and particularly mobility for people like students or older people who may not be able to or can't drive or don't have a car. Wisconsin did start just before the pandemic throughway service between they contracted through their Amtrak contract to operate a shuttle service with buses between Green Bay, the Fox Cities, Oshkosh, Fond du Lac, and Milwaukee. That makes direct connections to two of the Hiawatha trains. And they've told us that ridership has been growing quite a bit, and it sort of gives impetus to the fact that a future Green Bay corridor certainly could be successful. This is a sample schedule that Arun Rao showed us a couple of years ago, actually, I think, or a year and a half ago, before he left WisDOT, of a potential shuttle service from Menominee to Toma. And in fact, if it could also have a shuttle connecting with the Empire Builder, so you'd have two choices a day. So just an idea of what it might look like, and they'll have to get into the detail of that. So it's something we will be staying on top of as the TCMC service starts to move forward. We'll be asking the same question Mark just asked, is, okay, we want our shuttle service, let's get it going. My understanding on that is the issues they're working on right now are ensuring that Minnesota completes its funding cycle. Their legislature is just finishing up their budget. They do expect the funding to be there for the TCMC service. And then they're also working with Amtrak on equipment, and the Amtrak's equipment shortages has been a limiting factor. But Lisa said they are still optimistic about it starting late summer or fall this year. So we'll look forward to that. As I understand it, they'll be extending one of the Hiawatha frequencies initially to St. Paul. It will be the 1105 train out of Chicago that'll be extended, and then inbound. Actually, you can it'll leave, I think, St. Paul around 12:30 in the afternoon, get in Chicago a little bit after 7 on that Hiawatha frequency out of Milwaukee. So we'll be looking forward to that. I'm sure there'll be a lot of positive publicity about that when it gets started.
Say, Scott,
yeah,
if I could
please.
just add, for those that are on our call today, the Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago, or TCMC service is going to be rebranded and will be called Great River Service. Amtrak that's how they're going to market it. They're currently working out some things with their attorneys because there is the Great River Rail Commission in Minnesota, and there was some legal things that have to be worked out whether they can use that name. But as far as we know, it sounds like TCMC name will be replaced with Great River Rail or Great River Service. And at some point, Amtrak, when they market that, when it comes up on their ticketing system in the future, it'll be branded as Great River Service.
All right. Yeah. Just like the Hiawatha is the Chicago to Twin City or Chicago to Milwaukee service, or the Lincoln service is the St. Louis trains. Yeah. Through Springfield. Thanks, Mark. So one of the questions that comes up is, when do we need state funding, and is the state going to be friendly to this because of the history we've had in Wisconsin? And of course, what's interesting is Wisconsin has had one of the most successful state programs and has been able to expand and continue the Hiawatha service and move towards the TCMC or future Great River service. But what is the receptivity going to be when we do need that local funding, state funding? And also the fact that localities have almost no ability to raise revenue for transportation projects. So we currently are not looking for any funds for expansion other than operating the TCMC and continuing the Hiawatha in the current state budget. And really that's a timing issue, as if we get we and WSDOT do get our funding this fall, it's going to be a 1.5 to 2 year process to start undertaking the studies and putting the information together for what can be done to create service development plans for these services. And really the question that comes up, and it's one we've talked about at the MIPRC meetings, and certainly as citizens of our jurisdictions and of our states, if there's going to be public money used, we want to be justified and we want a return on investment. And so part of the effort during the next 2 years will be to talk about why these are important, why they're valuable economically, and what might be some of the numbers that justify them. So a couple things just sort of give you clues to that. When WSDOT and MnDOT put together their numbers for the second train, they did come up with some initial numbers as to the economic benefit. And so, for instance, Wisconsin includes in their information about that service that they expect their annual cost for that service to be around $3.6 million, but that the economic benefits it'll create will be $25 million. Missouri, which is not known as a liberal state, operates the Missouri River Runner with Amtrak between St. Louis and Kansas City. They commissioned a study a couple of years ago of the economic impact of that service. They found that it cost them about $8 to $9 million to have their trains between Kansas City and St. Louis. But a couple of key numbers here. The economic activity created by those trains brings back $22 million in tax revenue and $208 million in overall economic activity. And Missouri DOT people who have been at our MIPRC meetings have said that this information is very well received by their legislature, and that they've therefore been very supportive of continuing to work on these services. And in fact, I'm not sure about their corridor applications, but when we were looking at expressions of interest, Missouri did put in expressions of interest to add service to places like St. Joseph, Springfield, and Hannibal. And so they're even considering service expansions in Missouri. The other thing that some of us have been working on in Wisconsin is from an economic standpoint, my colleagues at the Green Bay Chamber, Fox Cities Chamber, Milwaukee, and the Madison Region Economic Partnership, which is the counterpart to Momentum West here, have been putting an effort together to put together a list of businesses who support the consideration of passenger rail service in Wisconsin. And this is the statement that we came up with, saying that we support the expansion in high potential corridors, because it would be an investment for our economic future, that serving more cities would help us retain business, retain and attract talent, provide economic growth opportunities, quality of life, tourism, and add some resiliency to our transportation system, so we're not solely relying, in most cases, on driving. The coalition, with its initial list, did put together a letter of support to all of the Midwest, the Minnesota and Wisconsin applications, as well as ours. This was signed by the five of us, but there are a substantial number of key organizations in Wisconsin that are part of this. We've added some since then. This had to go in, of course, before the applications, and we are now continuing to add companies to this. So if you know of companies who'd like to sign on, all of the state universities and tech colleges in our region have signed on, and also the direct marketing organizations like the tourist agencies have become very interested in this, and we've had several tourism organizations say that they're in favor of this as well. So if you want to know more about that, or want to get a business signed on to that, just contact me when you get a chance, and I'll bring you in on that. One other new development that just happened last week is Wisconsin did come out with their final draft of the Wisconsin Rail Plan. By final draft, the word draft is still operative here. Earlier this winter, they came out with the initial draft. The Rail Coalition actually had a substantial number of comments on it. It is now open for public comment through June 10. I personally have not had a chance to read through it, and we'll probably bring our group together that looked at it before, but we would invite everybody to take a look at it, to go to WisDOT's website, to download it, and to look at the plan and see if you have any comments on it. Rail plans are required by FRA to be eligible for federal funding. So this is a step in helping those corridor applications be successful. This is a map from one of Lisa's earlier PowerPoint presentations showing the routes that are in the state rail plan. And of course, they're the same routes that they've submitted for the FRA applications. So you can see the existing service, and then the green lines are potential additional routes that are part of the state rail plan. So I'd invite you to do that. I will mention that, you know, some of us are interested in being a little bit more ambitious than this long term. And a map we have showed from time to time is the High Speed Rail Alliance has put together a map of routes in Wisconsin. I'll point out that the green lines are bus connections, or shuttle connections. But they also envision some other future services, so that you would serve Janesville, Stevens Point, central Wisconsin areas, that there are other routes that, as you build out this system and it grows, that would be worthwhile considering. So just sort of in conclusion, we always like to think ahead. And right now, if any of us are envisioning a trip to the Twin Cities, today or in the near future, this is certainly something you think you might encounter, especially if you go in during rush hour. And a lot of us would like to be doing this instead and being more productive with our time. We also know state universities are and institutions of higher education are a strong driver of ridership. Here's a train stopping in Menominee in the 40s. Here's a train stopping in Champaign, Illinois more recently. And we envision that happening for our communities. It's also a great way for families to travel, do things together, bring tourism to your communities. And even those that aren't directly on the train line, like California, we would hope to see shuttles to places like River Falls, Chippewa Falls, perhaps Rice Lake, and others where they're not directly on the line. So a little bit of information here about the Rail Coalition. If you're not currently a member, we'd invite you to go to our website and join. I do have my email address here, so if you have further questions about anything I talked about today, see my email address there. I'd welcome an email. And then we appreciate Mark and Dan Schillinger, who works with our website. We post these meetings after they're recorded within a few days. So if you wanted to go back and hear anything again, or you want to refer this to anybody else, we'd encourage you to do that as well. So we have a few minutes left, and if anybody has any questions or comments or anything you'd like to bring up, that would be
Me again.
talk about. Yeah, hey, Bill.
Site selection. That's kind of important for Hudson River Falls, New Richmond. What's the process? Are there key players? Will that be an overall assessment or local people making the decision?
I think what we, and Jim was at the meeting yesterday too, but of the commission, I think our vision right now is to start looking at what are the issues. And so the commission is going to appoint a committee to start looking at it and then put a working group together. So the idea there would be to bring in local people from each municipality. So the city planners, whoever they think would be appropriate. So for instance, here in Eau Claire, Jeremy Gregard on the city council is on the commission, and he has suggested, for instance, that Aaron White, our economic development director, and Dave Solberg, who is our city engineer, get involved in the process. We also plan to look at one of the things Ray Chambers would bring to discussion would be there are some federal programs for transportation-oriented development where if you're within a certain distance of a transportation site, a station stop, there are some very attractive financing opportunities for development, and it doesn't have to be just the train station. And then there's also zoning and things like that to make sure that you have the proper zoning around a rail station, and even looking into any other things, whether there needs to be any kind of statutory changes or others. So it initially, it would probably be a preliminary look at what are all the issues, and then each community is going to have to look at, okay, for what a train station would do for us, what's the best site? And we expect them to get involved. I would think also the fact that, for instance, River Falls and UW River Falls are interested in being connected with a direct shuttle, having that as a possibility as one of the equations for selecting a station site would be what would go into it. So I think initially we want to look at what are all the questions, identify what the questions are, and then once the grant comes through, then some of the grant could be devoted to taking those to the next step. Jim, I don't know if you want to add any comments to that. That's sort of how I think we envision it at this point.
Well, I just was thanking Bill for bringing it up, because I think that's the one location that would be very important to where the station is located at. And so it's access to the highways as well as to the tracks. So that's an area that we'll have to look at real hard as we go along. So, and keep that, keep River Falls in mind from both the education as well as the public. So,
and there's also the benefit of working together on it so that there's some consistency. And if you're looking into things, it's going to benefit all the potential stops and not just one, and not everybody's going it alone.
So it's exciting that, we're starting to talk about sites. That in itself is an exciting development. Moving to the first question I get asked is, who pays for the train station? My guess is it's around $5 million for a full station. And is that all on the local communities, or how does that work?
I don't know if we know that yet. That's sort of been the Amtrak model. They say, we'll stop there if you give us a station. I think we want to think more broadly than that. The other thing is we don't know yet about how all the federal funding opportunities will come together. So presumably some of the programs for implementing a new service could include some federal funds for the station. So it might be a certain amount, but there might be some funding available. And then the other thing that we're going to be hearing from Ray about is there are some underutilized federal programs for transportation-oriented development. And if I understood it right, and I'm starting to get into things I am not an expert in, there have been some fairly recent regulatory or statutory changes that make those more useful than they were in the past. And so there may be some things that could be tapped into. So it'd probably be like a lot of other economic development projects where you put a variety of sources together to make it work. It might be, TIF districts that you create. There's even the idea, and this would probably require some statutory effort, but creating a transportation district where, and that gets into this whole area of value capture, where when you make transportation improvements, you increase the value of the land around it and you create economic activity. And the concept of value capture is that somehow you access those economic benefits to either create the station facilities or even help support the ongoing service. So that's a very broad discussion, but there's a chance for some innovation there. It is something that is done around the world and has been done in other communities as well.
Thank you.
This is Mark. One thing that I just want to mention before we sign off, if any of you have an interest, on Saturday, June 3rd and Sunday, June 4th, St. Paul Union Depot is doing their Train Days event, and they will have model railroad displays there. MnDOT will be there, All Aboard Minnesota. I'm going to have a table out for the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. And if you want more information, just Google St. Paul Union Depot, and they'll have all the information on their website. I just wanted to pass that along if you have an interest. And I believe the times are 10 to 4 on Saturday and 10 to 4 on Sunday. Thanks.
I've attended that in the past and it is fun to do. So good reason to go over and scope out Union Depot. And we had at the commission meeting yesterday, we had a presentation from Kevin Roggenbuck there with Ramsey County Regional Rail Authority. And they have some improvements they're planning to facilitate the TCMC, which then would also facilitate trains from Eau Claire coming in as well. So they have this all in mind. They invested in this transportation hub and they would love to have some more trains stopping there.
I have a quick announcement. We got 100 people to sign a petition to support the train. And I want to send those names and a cover letter to some local government officials. And so if anybody knows of a person who is maybe on the fence or something where this might reinforce or urge their support, there's obviously a weaker support in Pierce County and River Falls. But if there's a specific person, please let me know.
Right. And I also see that Dave Osnes is on the call, and he's usually doesn't have a good enough internet connection to jump in, but you might touch base with Dave too. I know he's actually a St. Croix County supervisor down by River Falls, but he may have some ideas for you. I will say that the commission, UW River Falls has been very involved in the commission. They've continued to attend the meetings and support it, and they signed on to the Business Coalition letter. And then the city has been participating lately too, one of the city planners. So
good.
So they're not an official member, but they've been paying attention and been interested. So
yeah, and
all
Dave
right.
was instrumental in generating those petitions.
Okay, great. All right, any other questions? We're a little bit past 9, so if you've had to drop off, we appreciate that. If not, for those of you on the board, we'll probably with a state rail plan coming out and potentially needing to give some comments, we'll probably try to schedule a board meeting sometime before that June 10th date. And I'd encourage you, if you have a chance, to look through it and see if you have any comments. One of the challenges, I think they substantially reorganized the plan itself from the initial draft, so it's a little harder to take our comments and directly find where we suggested they change. But hopefully, I hope to do that in the near future and encourage anybody else to, and not just board members. If anybody looks at that and you have comments, let us know. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for your participation. We appreciate your interest, and we're getting closer to buying tickets, so let's look forward to that day. Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.